The arrogance of youth. The city of Los Angeles was alive with its usual hustle and bustle. The sun was setting behind the skyline, casting golden hues over the streets. A young teenager, Jason Carter, strutted down a busy avenue with his group of friends. Jason was the definition of privilege, raised in wealth, given everything he wanted, and never having to work for anything. He carried himself with an air of superiority, his laughter often laced with condescension. As he walked, he noticed an older man struggling to sweep the sidewalk outside a high-end restaurant. The man, who appeared to be in his late 40s, had only one arm. His uniform was slightly worn, his movements slow but determined. Despite his apparent struggle, he remained focused on his work. Jason stopped in his tracks, nudging his friend Kyle. "Look at this guy," he snickered. "How does someone like him even get a job? I bet he's slower than a turtle." His friends burst into laughter, and Jason continued with his mockery. "Maybe he lost his arm trying to keep up with work," he joked, his voice dripping with cruelty. Unbeknownst to Jason, someone had been watching the scene unfold. Standing a few feet away, leaning against a sleek black motorcycle, was none other than Keanu Reeves. The Hollywood star had just finished dinner with a friend and was preparing to leave when he overheard Jason's remarks. Keanu was no stranger to hardship. He had faced immense loss in his life, yet he had always chosen kindness. Seeing Jason's arrogance sparked something inside him, a desire to teach this young man a lesson he wouldn't forget. Approaching the group, Keanu placed his helmet under his arm and casually said, "You think you're funny, huh?" Jason turned, his laughter fading as he recognized the man standing before him. "Wait, you're Keanu Reeves," he stammered. Keanu nodded, his expression calm but serious. "Yeah. And you? What's your name?" Jason," the teenager muttered. Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Jason, let me ask you something. Do you know that man you were just laughing at?" Jason scoffed. "No. Why would I?" Keanu sighed. "Because if you did, you'd know that he's a war veteran. He lost his arm saving people in combat. He didn't choose to lose it. But what he did choose was to keep moving forward, to work hard despite his circumstances." Jason shifted uncomfortably, but he tried to maintain his bravado. "Look, I was just joking. No big deal." Keanu's eyes darkened slightly. "It is a big deal. Mocking someone's struggles. That's not humor, that's cruelty. And trust me, life has a way of humbling people who think they're above others." Jason scoffed, but there was an edge of nervousness in his laugh. "And what? You're gonna lecture me like my dad or something?" Keanu smirked slightly. "No, I have a better idea." He pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "Hey, Charlie, I've got someone here who needs a little life lesson. Think you can help?" Jason frowned. "Who's Charlie?" Keanu pocketed his phone. "You'll see." He then turned back to the disabled worker and handed him a few crisp $100 bills. "For your patience," Keanu said with a kind smile. The man nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, sir." As Jason and his friends watched, Keanu turned back to the teenager. "Meet me here tomorrow morning at 6 a.m., if you have the guts." Jason hesitated. Waking up early wasn't his thing, and he didn't like being told what to do. But the thought of spending time with Keanu Reeves intrigued him. "Fine, I'll be here." Keanu gave him a nod and walked away, leaving Jason with a strange feeling in his chest, one he couldn't quite name. What had he just agreed to? And what lesson was Keanu planning to teach him? The wake-up call. The piercing sound of Jason's alarm clock jolted him awake at 5:30 a.m. He groaned, slapping the snooze button with more force than necessary. The room was still dark, the city outside not yet stirring. For a moment, he considered skipping out on the meeting with Keanu Reeves. After all, who was this guy to tell them what to do? But curiosity gnawed at him. Keanu Reeves wasn't just some random person. He was a Hollywood legend, known for his movies and his kindness. Jason couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, this would be interesting. Besides, he couldn't risk the embarrassment of Keanu thinking. He was too scared to show up. Dragging himself out of bed, Jason threw on some designer clothes, his hair still messy from sleep. He wasn't about to put in any extra effort for this. After all, what could Keanu possibly have planned? By 5:55 a.m., Jason was standing at the same spot where he'd mocked the disabled worker the day before. The streets were eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the usual bustling energy of Los Angeles. His friends were nowhere to be seen. They had laughed off the idea of waking up this early. At exactly 6:00 a.m., the sound of a motorcycle engine echoed through the street. Keanu pulled up beside Jason, dressed in a simple black jacket, jeans, and boots. His demeanor was calm, but his eyes held a certain intensity. "You made it," Keanu said, removing his helmet and offering a small smile. Jason shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "Yeah, well, figured I'd see what this was all about." Keanu nodded. "Good. Let's go." Without another word, Keanu handed Jason a spare helmet. Jason hesitated for a moment before slipping it on. He climbed onto the back of the motorcycle, unsure of what he'd just signed up for. They rode through the quiet streets, the cool morning air whipping against Jason's face. After about 20 minutes, Keanu pulled up in front of a modest-looking building with a faded sign that read Hope Community Center. Jason frowned. "What is this place?" Keanu dismounted, setting his helmet on the bike. "This is where your lesson begins." Reluctantly, Jason followed Keanu inside. The center was already buzzing with activity. Volunteers were unloading boxes of food, organizing clothes, and setting up tables. The air smelled of fresh coffee and determination. Keanu led Jason to a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Jason, this is Maria. She runs this place." "Maria, this is Jason. He's here to help today." Maria's smile didn't waver, but her eyes seemed to see right through Jason's bravado. "Nice to meet you, Jason. We're glad to have you." Jason opened his mouth to protest, but Keanu cut him off. "You're going to spend the day here, helping, listening, learning." Jason scoffed. "Seriously, this is what you dragged me out of bed for?" Keanu's expression hardened slightly. "Yes, and you're staying. Unless, of course, you're too afraid to get your hands dirty." Jason bristled at the challenge. "Fine. Whatever." The day began with unloading food donations from a truck. Jason struggled with the heavy boxes, his muscles aching in ways they never had at the gym. Sweat dripped down his face as he tried to keep up with the other volunteers, many of whom were older than him but worked with effortless strength and determination. As the hours dragged on, Jason found himself working alongside people he would have never interacted with in his privileged life. There was Sam, a soft-spoken man in his 60s who had lost his home after a medical emergency wiped out his savings. Despite his hardships, Sam worked with a quiet dignity that Jason couldn't ignore. Then there was Lena, a young woman not much older than Jason. She shared her story during a break, explaining how she'd grown up in foster care and now dedicated her time to helping others avoid the same struggles. Listening to their stories, Jason felt a strange, unfamiliar tug at his chest. These people had faced more challenges than he could imagine, yet they approached life with gratitude and resilience. By late afternoon, Jason was exhausted. His muscles screamed, his hands were blistered, and his expensive clothes were stained with dirt and sweat. But for the first time, he didn't care. As the day wound down, Keanu approached Jason, handing him a bottle of water. "How are you feeling?" Jason took a long drink, wiping his face with his sleeve. "Tired," he admitted. "But, I don't know. It's different. These people, they've been through so much, and they're still standing." Keanu nodded, his gaze steady. "Yeah, life isn't about what you have. It's about how you treat people. The man you laughed at yesterday, he's faced more battles than you can imagine. But he chooses kindness. That's strength. Jason looked down at his feet, the weight of his actions sinking in. I didn't know. Keanu placed a hand on Jason's shoulder. Now you do. And knowing is the first step. But what you do with that knowledge, that's what matters. As they left the community center, Jason felt something shift inside him. The arrogance that once defined him had been chipped away, replaced by a growing sense of humility. But Keanu wasn't finished. As they rode through the city once more, Keanu spoke over his shoulder. This is just the beginning, Jason. Tomorrow, we visit someone else. Someone who'll show you what true perseverance looks like. Jason didn't argue this time. Instead, he felt a strange anticipation building in his chest. For the first time in his life, he was ready to learn. The man behind the story. The following morning, Jason awoke without the aid of his alarm clock. His muscles still ached from the day before, and his hands were tender with blisters, but there was a new weight in his chest, one that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. The stories he had heard at the Hope Community Center haunted his thoughts. Faces and voices blended into his dreams, stirring something unfamiliar. Empathy. For the first time in his privileged life, Jason felt the discomfort of realizing how little he understood the world beyond his own bubble. By 5:30 a.m., he was already dressed, wearing a plain t-shirt and jeans. Nothing fancy, nothing flashy. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he barely recognized the person staring back. Gone was the smug teenager who had laughed at a man's hardship. In his place stood someone quieter, more uncertain, but somehow stronger. At exactly 6:00 a.m., Jason found Keanu waiting at the same spot, perched casually on his motorcycle. The actor gave him an approving nod as Jason approached. Right on time, Keanu said, handing him the spare helmet. Jason slipped it on without a word, climbing onto the back of the bike. The city was just waking up, the early morning light casting a golden glow over the skyline. As they rode, Jason found himself wondering where Keanu was taking him this time. Yesterday had been eye-opening, but something told him today would be even more significant. After nearly 30 minutes of winding through quieter streets, they pulled up in front of a modest, single-story house with peeling paint and a small, overgrown garden. It was a far cry from the mansions Jason was used to seeing in his wealthy neighborhood. Keanu killed the engine and removed his helmet, motioning for Jason to follow. "Where are we?" Jason asked, glancing around the quiet street. Keanu didn't answer right away. Instead, he led Jason up the cracked walkway and knocked on the door. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing the same one-armed man Jason had mocked just 2 days before. Jason's stomach dropped. The man's eyes flicked between Keanu and Jason, his expression unreadable. But instead of the anger or resentment Jason expected, the man simply stepped aside and motioned them in. "This is David Morales," Keanu said quietly, "and today you're going to hear his story." Inside, the house was simple but clean. The walls were adorned with photos, family gatherings, military portraits, and snapshots of a younger David standing proudly in uniform. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. David gestured for them to sit in the small living room. His movements were slow but steady, his remaining arm surprisingly strong as he poured them each a cup of coffee. "So," David began, his voice deep and steady, "I hear you had something to say about me the other day." Jason's face burned with shame. He struggled to find the right words, but none seemed enough. I'm sorry," he finally whispered. "I didn't know." David chuckled softly, not unkindly. "That's the thing about people like you. You'd never know until life smacks you in the face. But the real question is, what do you do after you know?" Jason swallowed hard, nodding. "I want to understand. I really do." David studied him for a moment, then leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to one of the photos on the wall. "I wasn't always like this," he began. Jason's breath caught in his throat. David tapped the stump of his missing arm. "Lost this saving his life. But you know what? I'd do it again in a heartbeat." For a moment, the room was silent. Jason felt a lump rising in his throat, the magnitude of David's sacrifice hitting him like a punch to the gut. But that wasn't the hardest part. David continued, his voice softer now. Coming home was. You expect to be welcomed back as a hero, but the world moves on without you. Jobs don't come easy when you're missing a limb. People look at you different. Some even laugh. His eyes flicked to Jason, but there was no malice in them, only a quiet sadness. I tried to find work, David went on, but no one wanted to hire a one-armed veteran. Took me years just to land that janitor job at the restaurant. And you know what? I'm proud of it, because it's honest work. It keeps me going. Jason felt his eyes sting with unused tears. He had spent his entire life taking things for granted, his health, his privilege, his opportunities, and here was a man who had given everything for others, only to be met with indifference and cruelty. I'm so sorry, Jason whispered again, his voice trembling. I didn't know. I didn't understand. David leaned forward, his gaze steady and unwavering. Now you do. And that means you've got a choice. You can go back to your life, pretend this never happened, or you can do something with what you've learned. Keanu, who had been silent the entire time, finally spoke. Life has a funny way of teaching us lessons when we least expect it. The question is, are you ready to listen? Jason nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of responsibility, not just to himself, but to the people around him. As they left David's house, Jason turned to Keanu. What do I do now? Keanu smiled, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. You start by paying it forward. Kindness isn't about grand gestures, Jason. It's about the little things, the choices you make every day. Jason nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle deep within him. This wasn't just about making amends. It was about becoming someone better. But his journey was far from over. Keanu had one more lesson in store, one that would test everything Jason had learned. The challenge of change. The ride back from David's house was quieter than before. Jason sat on the back of Keanu's motorcycle, his mind racing with thoughts, emotions, and questions that had never crossed his mind until now. The city streets blurred around him. But for the first time, he wasn't paying attention to the neon lights or fancy cars. All he could think about was David's story. The weight of that sacrifice, the quiet dignity in his voice, and the sheer strength it took to face each day with one arm and a world that barely cared. When Keanu finally pulled up outside a small, unassuming diner, Jason was surprised. He expected to head home after such an emotional day, but Keanu had other plans. The diner wasn't flashy. It was the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. The neon sign buzzed faintly, and the windows were fogged from the warmth inside. Keanu killed the engine and turned to Jason. Hungry. Jason, still reeling from everything he'd heard, just nodded. They stepped inside, greeted by the comforting scent of fresh coffee, bacon, and old wood. The place had a homey feel, with worn leather booths and a jukebox quietly playing an old blues tune in the corner. They slid into a booth near the window. Keanu ordered a simple black coffee, while Jason, still too caught up in his thoughts to think about food, just asked for water. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like a necessary pause, a moment to let everything settle. Finally, Keanu broke the silence. You did good today, he said, stirring his coffee. Jason gave a small, humorless laugh. I don't know about that. I feel like I've been a complete jerk my whole life. Keanu's eyes softened. We all make mistakes, Jason. What matters is what you do after you realize them. Jason nodded, staring down at his glass. I want to do better. I just don't know how. Keanu leaned back, studying Jason carefully. Change isn't a one-time thing. It's a series of choices you make every day. But if you're serious about this, I've got one more place to take you tomorrow. Jason raised an eyebrow. Another lesson. Keanu smiled faintly. You could call it that, but this one's going to be different. It's not just about listening. It's about doing. Jason felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness. The past 2 days had been more intense than anything he'd experienced, but something inside him wanted to keep going, to see this through. The next morning, Jason was up even earlier. He didn't need the alarm. His mind was already awake, buzzing with curiosity. He dressed simply again, comfortable clothes that didn't scream privilege. By 5:45 a.m., he was at the usual spot, waiting for Keanu. This time, when Keanu arrived, there was a different energy in the air. He didn't say much as Jason hopped onto the bike, and the ride felt longer than the previous ones. They traveled out of the city, the streets giving way to quieter roads lined with trees and open fields. Eventually, they pulled up in front of a large old building with a faded sign that read, "The Phoenix Rehabilitation Center." The place looked worn but sturdy, like it had seen its fair share of stories. Jason frowned, glancing at Keanu as they dismounted. "What is this place?" Keanu's face was serious. "This is where people come to rebuild their lives. Some are recovering from injuries, others from addiction, and some from both. Today, you're not just going to listen. You're going to be part of their journey." Jason felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't sure he was ready for this, but he nodded anyway. He trusted Keanu now, more than he trusted anyone in a long time. Inside, the center was bustling with activity. There were people of all ages, some in wheelchairs, some with prosthetic limbs, and others who bore invisible scars. The atmosphere wasn't one of sadness, though. It was filled with determination, hope, and resilience. A tall woman with a no-nonsense attitude greeted them at the front desk. She had short, silver hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen everything but still held a spark of kindness. "Keanu," she said, smiling warmly. "Good to see you again." Keanu shook her hand. "Good to see you too, Margaret. This is Jason. He's here to help today." Margaret gave Jason a once-over, her sharp eyes making him feel like she could see right through him. "You ready to work, kid?" Jason swallowed hard and nodded. "Yeah, I'm ready." Margaret didn't waste time. She handed Jason a schedule and pointed him toward the physical therapy wing. "You'll be helping Daniel today. He's a tough one, but he's got a heart of gold." Jason followed the directions, his heart pounding in his chest. When he arrived at the therapy room, he saw a man in his late 20s struggling to lift himself from a wheelchair onto a set of parallel bars. His face was contorted with effort, sweat dripping down his forehead. "Hey, Daniel," Jason said cautiously, unsure of how to start. Daniel glanced up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You the new volunteer?" Jason nodded. "Yeah, I'm here to help." Daniel didn't say anything for a moment. Then, with a grunt, he motioned toward a towel on the nearby bench. "Hand me that, will you?" Jason quickly grabbed the towel and handed it over. As Daniel wiped the sweat from his face, Jason noticed the heavy brace on his leg and the deep scars that ran up his arm. "What happened?" Jason asked gently. Daniel shot him a look but saw the genuine curiosity in Jason's eyes. With a sigh, he said, "Car accident. Drunk driver hit me head-on. Lost most of the use in my left leg. Doctor said I'd never walk again." Jason felt a familiar sting in his chest. "But you're here. Trying." Daniel chuckled dryly. "Yeah, because giving up isn't an option." The words hit Jason harder than he expected. For the next few hours, he helped Daniel with his exercises, holding the bars steady, encouraging him when the pain became too much, and listening when Daniel shared his frustrations. As the day wore on, Jason realized something profound. These people weren't just fighting physical battles. They were fighting mental ones too. Every step, every small victory, was a testament to their willpower. By the end of the session, Daniel managed to take a few shaky steps on his own. Jason felt a swell of pride, not for himself, but for Daniel's determination. "You did it," Jason whispered. Daniel looked at him, a small, tired smile on his face. "No, we did it." Those words echoed in Jason's mind as he left the center with Keanu later that day. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. As they rode back into the city, Keanu finally spoke. "So, what do you think?" Jason didn't hesitate. I think I've been blind my whole life, but I don't want to be that person anymore." Keanu smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "Then don't be." Jason knew it wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But for the first time, he was ready to face it. And this was only the beginning. The weight of responsibility. The city lights flickered to life as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the streets. But for Jason, everything felt different now. The same streets he'd walked 1,000 times before. The same places he laughed with his friends, oblivious to the struggles around him, now felt like they belonged to a different world, a world he no longer fit into. After leaving the Phoenix Rehabilitation Center, Jason thought the hardest part was over. He had met people who'd faced unimaginable hardships, people who had lost limbs, loved ones, and even parts of themselves. But they hadn't lost their spirit. They fought every day to rebuild their lives. That courage had ignited something inside Jason. But what Keanu said next caught him off guard. "This is just the first step," Keanu murmured as they rode back into the city, his voice calm yet resolute. "Now it's time for you to carry this forward. Alone." Jason frowned, the words echoing in his helmet. Alone. They pulled up outside Jason's apartment complex, a towering building with gleaming windows and a valley out front. Keanu killed the engine and turned to Jason. "You've seen what struggle looks like. You've heard their stories. But none of it matters if you go back to your old life tomorrow, pretending this never happened." Keanu's eyes met Jason's, steady and piercing. "I'm not going to be around to hold your hand. It's up to you now." Jason felt a pang of fear settle in his chest. The thought of facing everything alone, without Keanu's guidance, made his stomach churn. But he understood. This wasn't just about learning. It was about doing. "All right," Jason whispered. "I'll do it." Keanu gave him a small nod of approval. "Good. I'll be watching." And with that, Keanu revved his motorcycle and disappeared into the night, leaving Jason standing on the sidewalk, feeling more alone and more determined than ever. The next morning, Jason woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was a message from an unknown number. "Hope Community Center, 7 a.m. They need help with the food drive. Thought you might want to know. K." Jason stared at the message for a long moment. He could have ignored it, gone back to sleep, pretended that the past few days were just a weird detour in his otherwise perfect life. But he couldn't. Not after everything he'd seen. Not after David, Daniel, and the countless others who had shown him what true strength looked like. By 6:45 a.m., Jason was at the Hope Community Center. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the cool morning air felt refreshing against his skin. But as he approached the building, a familiar wave of anxiety washed over him. What if they don't want me here? What if they still see me as that arrogant kid who laughed at a disabled man? But when he stepped inside, he was met with warm smiles and friendly greetings. "Hey, Jason." Maria, the center's coordinator, called out, waving him over. "Glad you could make it." Jason's nerves eased slightly. He spent the morning unloading boxes of canned goods, organizing supplies, and helping distribute food to families in need. But it wasn't just about the work. It was about the people. He met Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who'd lost her home after her husband passed away. Despite her situation, she had the brightest smile and offered Jason homemade cookies as a thank you. He met Carlos, a young boy around 10 years old, who came with his mother to pick up groceries. Carlos had dreams of becoming an astronaut and excitedly told Jason about the stars, his eyes lighting up with every word. For the first time, Jason realized that these people weren't defined by their struggles. They were defined by their dreams, their resilience, and their kindness. But the real test came later that afternoon. As Jason was packing up to leave, he saw a familiar figure entering the community center. It was Kyle, his best friend, the same friend who had laughed along with him just days ago when they mocked David. "Yo, Jason," Kyle called out, grinning. "What are you doing here, man? Volunteering? Since when are you into this charity stuff?" Jason felt his stomach twist. Part of him wanted to laugh it off, to slip back into the comfortable role he'd always played around Kyle. But he couldn't. Not anymore. "I'm helping out," Jason replied, his voice steady. "And it's not charity stuff. These are real people, Kyle. People with real stories." Kyle raised an eyebrow, clearly confused. "Dude, you're acting weird. Come on, let's bail." "There's a party at Jake's place tonight." Jason shook his head. "I'm staying." Kyle's grin faded. "You serious?" Jason nodded. "Yeah, I am." For a moment, there was a tense silence between them. Kyle looked at him like he was a stranger, and in a way he was. Jason wasn't the same person he'd been a few days ago, and maybe that meant losing some friends along the way. "Whatever, man," Kyle finally muttered, turning to leave. "You've changed." Jason watched him go, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. "Yeah," he thought, "I have." Over the next few weeks, Jason continued volunteering at the Hope Community Center and the Phoenix Rehabilitation Center. He started organizing fundraising events, using his social media to spread awareness about the people he'd met and the stories they'd shared. But the real turning point came when he decided to do something bigger. One evening, after a long day at the rehabilitation center, Jason sat down at his computer and began typing. He poured his heart into a blog post, sharing everything he'd experienced, the people he'd met, the lessons he'd learned, and the mistakes he'd made. He didn't hold back. He talked about mocking David, about his privileged life, and about how Keanu Reeves had shown him a path to redemption. He titled it, "The Day I Laughed at a Disabled Man, and How Keanu Reeves Changed My Life." He hesitated before hitting publish, unsure of how people would react. But he knew it needed to be shared. He needed to own his mistakes if he truly wanted to change. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, the post went viral. Thousands of people commented, sharing their own stories of struggle and redemption. Some criticized him, saying he didn't deserve forgiveness, but many more applauded his honesty and willingness to change. And then, one comment stood out from the rest. "Proud of you, kid. Keep going. K." Jason smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. He wasn't doing this for validation, but knowing Keanu was still watching, still guiding him from afar, meant more than he could express. But Jason knew this was just the beginning. The road to becoming a better person was long and filled with challenges, but he was ready to face them. Because now, he understood the true meaning of strength, not in wealth, not in status, but in kindness, empathy, and the courage to change. The test of integrity. A month had passed since Jason's blog post went viral, but the ripple effect it created felt like it had transformed his entire world overnight. His inbox was flooded with messages, some from people sharing their own stories of hardship and growth, others from former friends who didn't recognize the new person he was becoming. But the most unexpected messages came from strangers who were inspired by his journey. Despite the praise, Jason knew better than to rest on his laurels. Words were easy. Actions were harder, and he was determined to prove, not just to the world but to himself, that he was serious about this change. But life, as it often does, had its own plans. It was a sunny afternoon when Jason received an unexpected call from Maria, the coordinator at the Hope Community Center. "Jason," Maria's voice crackled through the phone, tinged with urgency. "I need your help. We're facing some trouble here." Jason felt his pulse quicken. What kind of trouble? Maria hesitated, then sighed. "We've been accused of mismanaging funds. Someone reported that donations are being mishandled, And now we're under investigation. If we can't prove our innocence, the center could be shut down." Jason's heart sank. He knew how much the community center meant to everyone, how many lives it touched. The thought of it closing was unbearable. "I'll be right there," he said, grabbing his jacket and rushing out the door. When Jason arrived at the community center, the atmosphere was tense. Volunteers whispered in hushed tones, and Maria was pacing near the front desk, her brow furrowed with worry. "What happened?" Jason asked, approaching her. Maria looked up, relief washing over her face at the sight of him. "An anonymous tipster claimed that we've been diverting donations for personal use. The authorities are coming tomorrow to review our financial records." Jason frowned. "But that's not true. We've seen how hard everyone works here." Maria nodded. "I know. But accusations like this can ruin us, even if they're false." Jason clenched his fists, feeling a surge of determination. "We'll find out who did this. We're not letting this place go down without a fight." Jason spent the rest of the day combing through records, receipts, and donation logs. It was tedious work, but he was relentless. As he dug deeper, something odd caught his eye. Several large donations had been made under names he didn't recognize, and the amounts didn't match the official records. His gut told him something was off. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Jason decided to confront someone who had been noticeably absent lately: Kyle. Since their fallout at the community center weeks ago, Jason hadn't seen or heard from his old friend. But something about the timing of these accusations felt suspicious. Kyle had always been reckless, but Jason couldn't believe he'd go this far, or could he? That evening, Jason showed up at Kyle's apartment, his heart pounding in his chest. He knocked on the door, unsure of how this confrontation would go. When Kyle finally opened the door, his expression shifted from surprise to annoyance. "What do you want, man?" Kyle grumbled. Jason didn't waste time. "Did you report the community center?" Kyle's eyes flickered with something: guilt, fear. But he quickly masked it with a smirk. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb," Jason snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. "I saw the records. Someone's been messing with the donations, and you've been acting weird ever since I stopped hanging out with you." Kyle's smirk faded, replaced by a defensive glare. "So what if I did? You've been acting like some saint, volunteering and pretending you're better than the rest of us. I thought I'd bring you back down to reality." Jason stared at him, stunned. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Kyle had always been immature, but this was malicious. "You could ruin people's lives," Jason said quietly, his voice trembling with anger. "Do you even realize that?" Kyle shrugged, as if it didn't matter. "They'll be fine. It's just a stupid charity. Besides, you'll thank me when you're back at the parties, living the good life." Jason took a step back, shaking his head. "I'm not that person anymore." Kyle scoffed. "Yeah. Let's see how long that lasts." Jason left the apartment with his heart pounding, but his resolve stronger than ever. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, he went straight to the authorities handling the investigation and shared everything he'd discovered. He handed over the donation records, detailed his suspicions about Kyle, and provided all the evidence he had gathered. It wasn't easy. Turning in a former friend felt like a betrayal. But Jason knew the real betrayal would be letting the community center suffer for something it didn't do. A few days later, the investigation concluded. The authorities cleared the Hope Community Center of all wrongdoing, and Kyle was charged with fraud and making false reports. It wasn't just about the money. It was about trying to destroy something good out of spite. When Maria shared the news with the volunteers, the room erupted in cheers and applause. But Jason felt something deeper than relief. He felt pride. Not the arrogant pride he used to carry, but the quiet pride of knowing he had done the right thing, even when it was hard. As the celebrations continued, Jason stepped outside for some fresh air. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. That's when he felt a familiar presence beside him. "You handled that well," Keanu's voice said softly. Jason turned to see Keanu standing there, his signature calm expression on his face. "I didn't think you'd show up," Jason admitted, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Keanu shrugged. "Didn't need to. You've got this." Jason felt a warmth spread through his chest. "Thanks for everything." Keanu nodded, placing a hand on Jason's shoulder. "The world needs more people willing to stand up for what's right. Keep being that person." Jason nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle into his heart. He wasn't perfect. He'd made mistakes. But now he understood that real strength wasn't about never falling. It was about getting back up and helping others do the same. As Keanu walked away, blending into the city's evening glow, Jason knew his journey wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. Because now he wasn't just living for himself. He was living to make a difference. The legacy of kindness. 6 months had passed since Jason Carter's life took a sharp, unexpected turn. What started as a cruel joke at the expense of a disabled worker had spiraled into a journey of self-discovery, humility, and redemption. The boy who once scoffed at the struggles of others was now a young man with a mission, one that went far beyond his own personal growth. But Jason was about to learn that the ripple effects of kindness don't just change one life. They can change many. The Hope Community Center was buzzing with activity, but this time, it wasn't just for a food drive or a volunteer day. Today was special. It was the grand opening of the Moralist Foundation for Resilience and Recovery, named after none other than David Morales, the veteran Jason had once cruelly mocked and later befriended. Jason had poured his heart into this project. He'd worked tirelessly, using the connections he'd made through his viral blog post and social media influence to secure funding, resources, and volunteers. But the idea wasn't his alone. It was born from the stories he'd heard, the people he'd met, David, Daniel, Maria, and countless others who had shown him the true meaning of strength and perseverance. The new wing of the community center would offer rehabilitation services, job training programs, and support groups for veterans, people with disabilities, and anyone facing life's harshest battles. It was more than just a building. It was a symbol of hope. As the crowd gathered outside, Jason stood nervously at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces. Some were familiar, volunteers, community members, and friends who had been part of this journey from the start. Others were strangers who had been inspired by his story and had come to witness the impact firsthand. But one face in the crowd stood out more than any other. Keanu Reeves. Dressed in his usual understated style, Keanu leaned casually against a tree at the edge of the gathering, his signature calm demeanor never wavering. Their eyes met, and Keanu gave Jason a small, knowing nod. It was all the encouragement Jason needed. Taking the deep breath, Jason stepped up to the microphone. 6 months ago, Jason began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I was a different person. I thought I had it all. Money, friends, a life most people would envy. But I was blind. Blind to the struggles of the people around me, blind to the impact of my actions, and blind to the power of kindness. He paused, letting the words sink in. I laughed at a man who had given everything for his country. I mocked someone who showed more courage in a single day than I had in my entire life. And that moment, that mistake, changed everything. Jason's eyes scanned the crowd, landing on David Morales, who stood proudly near the front. His one good arm rested on his cane, but his eyes shone with pride. I met people who taught me what real strength looks like, Jason continued, his voice growing stronger. People like David Morales, who sacrificed more than I can imagine, but never gave up. People like Daniel, who fought through pain and doubt to walk again. And people like Maria, who dedicated her life to helping others, even when the world tried to tear her down. The crowd was silent, hanging on to every word. This foundation isn't just a building. It's a promise that no one will be left behind, that every person, no matter their struggle, will have a place where they are seen, heard, and supported. Because kindness isn't just about grand gestures. It's about the small choices we make every day. Jason's voice wavered slightly, but he pressed on. I stand here today not as the person I was, but as the person I'm becoming. And I owe that to all of you, to the people who showed me that it's never too late to change, and to one man in particular who taught me that the greatest strength lies in humility, empathy, and the courage to do what's right. Jason's eyes met Keanu's once more. Keanu Reeves, thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. The crowd erupted into applause, and Jason felt tears prick the corners of his eyes. But they weren't tears of regret or shame. They were tears of gratitude. After the ceremony, as people mingled and explored the new wing, Jason finally made his way over to Keanu. The actor greeted him with a warm handshake and a rare, genuine smile. You've come a long way, Keanu said, his voice low and sincere. Jason chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. I couldn't have done it without you. Keanu shook his head. You did the work. I just pointed you in the right direction. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as David gave a tour of the rehabilitation center to a group of veterans. The atmosphere was filled with hope and possibility, a stark contrast to the tension and despair Jason had felt when he first walked into the community center all those months ago. What's next for you? Keanu asked, glancing at Jason. Jason thought for a moment, then smiled. I don't know exactly, but I know I'm not done. There are more stories to hear, more people to help. This is just the beginning. Keanu nodded, his expression thoughtful. The world needs more people like you, Jason. Keep going. Jason felt a surge of pride, not the arrogant kind he once carried, but the quiet, fulfilling pride of knowing he was making a difference. As Keanu turned to leave, disappearing into the crowd, Jason felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew their paths might not cross again, but the lessons Keanu had taught him would stay with him forever. Months turned into years, and Jason's work continued to grow. The Morales Foundation expanded, opening branches in other cities, each one a beacon of hope for those in need. Jason traveled across the country, sharing his story, advocating for veterans, people with disabilities, and anyone struggling to find their place in the world. But no matter how far he went or how much he achieved, Jason never forgot where it all began. One day, while visiting a new foundation branch in a small town, Jason received a package with no return address. Inside was a simple note. The journey never ends. Keep walking the path. K. Beneath the note was a small worn coin with the words fortitude engraved on it. Jason smiled, feeling the familiar warmth in his chest. He slipped the coin into his pocket, a constant reminder of the journey he had taken and the one still ahead. Because kindness isn't a destination, it's a way of life. And Jason Carter was determined to live it every day.